In the history of pro wrestling power, there have been four men whose paths have always seemed to cross. Two teams, both of which started out as bitter rivals, but would go on to capture championship gold. These are the histories of Midnight Powerhouse and the Mad End. Our story begins on April 20th, 2019 at PWP's second high voltage event. Here, Midnight would make his first appearance as the silent enforcer to the goddess of destruction Lexa Nix in her war with the Charisma Kid, aiding her to a win. He would make his in-ring debut the following month at Mayhem, with a decisive victory over Stuart the Minion, as well as helping Lexa Nix to defeat the Hitman Rick Lloyd. The following month at Frostbite, Midnight would have yet another decisive victory against Charlie D. While he would help Lexa Nix in her Fugly Shield Falls Count Anywhere match against the Charisma Kid later in the night, the goddess would not walk out with the shield, and tension would begin to build between Lexa Nix and Midnight. The next month at Tough Stuff, Midnight would come out on his own for another decisive win over Stuart, though before he could celebrate, Lexa would send Midnight backstage as punishment for having a match without her permission. The lack of Midnight proved to be detrimental to Lexa Nix, as she would once again fail to defeat the Charisma Kid for the Fugly Shield. The following month at Hot August Nights, Midnight would pick up yet another decisive victory over Stuart, while Lexa would defeat Rocco Rumblay. The Dark Duo would finally be back on good terms by the end of the night, as they joined in on Champ Phoenix's open beatdown. They would finally be back in front of an audience together the following month at Razor's Edge, when Midnight would defeat Rocco Rumblay, though Midnight's assistance would not be effective later in the night, as the Charisma Kid would once again defeat Lexa Nix, though the Kid would be victim to a post-match beatdown before being saved by Rocco Rumblay. The next month at Halloween Hijinks, Midnight would face the Charisma Kid in a Falls Count Anywhere match for the 24/7 Fugly Shield. During the match, Midnight would put the Kid through a table before finally beating him for the shield. The next month at Fallout, the seeds of future rivalries would be sowed. Midnight would face the debuting Powerhouse Steve Andrews, where for the first time, Midnight would not have the size and strength advantage. The two eventually fought to a double countout, continuing to fight all the way out the back. Later that night, Midnight would be the first entrant in the $10,000 Rumble, that also saw the in-ring debuts of Dan the End and Mad Mick, who immediately came to blows. During the Rumble, Midnight would defy his goddess, leading to Nix hitting Midnight with a pair of pedigrees, allowing Rocco Rumblay to pin Midnight for the Fugly Shield. Immediately after this, Midnight would eliminate Rocco from the Rumble, but Lexa would orchestrate a large group elimination of Midnight from the Rumble. When Steve Andrews entered, he would eliminate Mad Mick. The next event, Kings of Rock and Roll, took place in January and hosted a one-night tournament for the vacant PWP Championship. Not part of the tournament, Dan the End and Mad Mick faced off against each other to open the show, with Mick using his agility to avoid a clothesline and beat Dan with a flatliner. The following match would be the first match in the championship tournament, as Steve Andrews faced off against Rocco Rumblay. Just as it seemed like the Powerhouse had the match won, Midnight would interfere, chokeslamming Andrews to hand Rocco the win. Later in the night, Lexa Nix and Midnight would challenge the Minions in their first defense of the recently established PWP Tag Team Championship. The Powerhouse would get his revenge by taking Nix out on the outside and hitting Midnight with the Thunder Slam, allowing the Minions to win. The next month at Love and War, Dan the End and Mad Mick would once again face off in the opening match. This time, Dan would block a flatliner attempt and hit a TKO to even the score, though Mick would lay Dan out with the flatliner after the match. In the semi-main event of the night, Lexa Nix and Midnight would get their second chance at the Tag Team Championship. This time they would be successful, however after the match Nix would claim that they would defend their titles any time. The Powerhouse would immediately come out and challenge them to a 2-on-1 handicap match for the titles. Using Nix's foot to kick Midnight out of the ring, Andrews would pin Nix to become the new solo tag team champion. Nix would blame Midnight for the loss and would lay him out in the middle of the ring. The following month at Shamrocks and Shenanigans, Lex and Nyx would demand a rematch for the titles, which Andrews accepted on the condition that both Nyx and Midnight first beat him in individual singles matches. Midnight would challenge first and pick up a victory over the Powerhouse, fighting out of the torture rack slam to hit a choke slam. After the match though, Nyx would stop Midnight from celebrating, drawing all the attention to herself. Andrews would then offer his hand to Midnight, but before Midnight could shake it, Nyx slapped both men's hands away and told Midnight that he would not be allowed to accompany her for her match later in the night. Mad Mick and Dan the End would once again face off. This time, a moment of cockiness from Mick would cost him the match to Dan. After that, Midnight would attempt to accompany Lexa to the ring, but would be kicked back through the curtain. With some assistance from the minions, Andrews would pick up the victory over Lex and Nyx. Due to a global pandemic, all PWP shows will be put on hold for 6 months, finally returning on September 26, 2020 with Razor's Edge Red vs Blue. Following each match, wrestlers would draw either a red or blue ball from a bag to determine their team for the night's main event 5-on-5 elimination tag team match. Mad Mick and Dan the End would once again face off, with Mick once again evening the score between them at 2 apiece. However, after the match, both men would draw blue, putting the two rivals on the same team in the night's main event. Later on in the night, Midnight, now free of Lex and Nyx, would continue his rivalry with Steve Andrews in a hard-hitting match that saw Midnight boss Steve open with one of his gauntlets. However, the Powerhouse would win the match, catching Midnight's arm in a chokeslam attempt and taking him out with his torture rack slam. After the match, Andrews would draw red, while Midnight would draw blue. While all 4 men would be eliminated throughout the tag team match, being forced to work together had shown Dan and Mick what chemistry they had working as a team. And at the next event, Fallout, the two decided to put their differences aside and become an official tag team, very quickly dispatching of the minions. Later in the night, what was set to be a regular match between Midnight and Steve Andrews changed when the two agreed to end their feud that night with a strap match. In a match that left both men welted, the Powerhouse would get the final victory over Midnight. As Midnight struggled to stand up in the ring, the Powerhouse would return with Midnight ready to fight, but the Powerhouse would once again offer his hand, which Midnight accepted. The next month at SantaSlam, the newly named Mad End would face Andrews in a 2-on-1 handicap match. Despite everything they threw at him, the solo tag team champion would not go down, leading to Dan hitting the Powerhouse with a low blow, getting himself disqualified. However, as they beat the Powerhouse down after the match, Andrews would be saved by his old rival Midnight. Midnight would then go on to have another dominant victory over Stuart the Minion. The next month at New Year's Knockout, Mad Mick would score an upset victory over Midnight, while Dan the End would score an upset victory over Steve Andrews. Dan would then claim that he and Mick were owed another shot at the Tag Team Championship and offered to let the Powerhouse find a partner. The Powerhouse would choose Midnight as his partner, who proved to be effective, defeating the Mad End and being awarded half of the Tag Team Championship by Steve Andrews, marking Midnight's second reign with the title. The reign would be short-lived, however, as the following month at Love and War, the newly named Midnight Powerhouse would lose the titles to the Mad End after Dan would throw one of the title belts in the ring to distract the referee, only to strike Midnight with the other belt. The following month at March Madness, the former champions would call out their rivals for a rematch. The Mad End would give Midnight Powerhouse a very familiar offer, beat them in singles matches, and they would get another title shot. Andrews would be successful in defeating Mad Mick, but Midnight wouldn't be as successful, as an aid from Mick helped Dan pick up the win. With no challenges for the next event, Carnival Carnage, the Mad End decided to break the tie in their series of matches against each other and have one more singles match. With no other opponents available, Midnight and Steve Andrews would do the same. In the end, Dan would be victorious over Mick and would show no animosity to his rival-turned-partner after the match. Steve Andrews would then be victorious over Midnight, though unlike the Mad End, these rivals-turned-partners would not leave the ring together, and ultimately none of the four would be successful in the $10,000 Iron Bar Rumble. The following month at Chaos in the Cage, Mad Mick would come up short against Dino Mac before Steve Andrews would defeat Dan the End in a Falls Count Anywhere match. Midnight would then go on to challenge the undefeated Prince of Port Douglas, Marshall Sampson, ultimately falling when the Prince turned a spinebuster attempt into a guillotine to choke Midnight out. The next month at Serpent Bar Showdown would prove to be a pivotal moment for the four men, as all four would be entered into the first annual Rocco Rumble Battle Royal. While Steve would eliminate both members of the Mad End, Midnight would eliminate Marshall Sampson with some help from Chaos before both men would eliminate Bulldog Bailey, leaving the two partners as the final competitors. While it seemed as though the Powerhouse had won the match, Midnight managed to keep 1 foot off the ground and get back into the ring, eliminating Andrews to win the first Rocco Rumble Battle Royal and earn a future PWP Championship match. Later in the night though, Midnight Powerhouse would get another chance at the Tag Team Championship against the Mad End, which ended with Mad Mick using the ropes for leverage to pin Midnight. The following match saw Bulldog Bailey and Superman Matt Midnight of the Young Lions have a friendly competition, after which they were attacked by the Mad End, who were incensed that the crowd would cheer for the Young Lions. Midnight Powerhouse would confront newly appointed General Manager Phil Staley, fed up with the Mad End's cheating ways. Staley agreed that the former champions could have one more match under the condition that it be their final shot, and giving the Mad End the ultimatum to either defend their belts a second time that night, or be stripped of them. But before the match could begin, Lil Panda would interrupt and would be successful in adding the Young Lions to the match, and making it a 3-way elimination match. While a miscommunication would lead to Midnight Powerhouse being eliminated from the match, they would take their anger out on the Mad End, allowing the Young Lions to win the match and the titles. 4 months later, the next event, Law and Disorder, started with Midnight being awarded a trophy for his victory in the Rocco Rumble Battle Royal, before he was interrupted by Marshall Sampson, who talked down to Midnight about his weight, prompting Midnight to headbutt the Prince and leading to an impromptu match which Sampson would win by countout after whipping Midnight into the steps. Following that, Mad Mick would defeat the Powerhouse in a street fight that went all over the Serpent Bar. Dan the End would then face off against and defeat the Charisma Kid in the Kid's first match back in PWP since his match with Midnight 2 years earlier. The final match before the main event saw the new tag team champions, Bulldog Bailey and Superman Matt Midnight, once again face off in a friendly competition, after which they would again be beaten down by the Mad End, only to be saved by the Charisma Kid, though the Kid would immediately betray the Young Lions. The main event saw all teams split up as the 4-on-4 Red vs Blue match would pit the blue team of Captain Marshall Sampson, Mad Mick, Steve Andrews and Matt Midnight against the red team of Captain Midnight, Dan the End, Bulldog Bailey, and the now refusing to be called the Charisma Kid. Dan would be eliminated by a jackknife cover from the Superman, who himself would be eliminated by the Midnight assistant Bulldog Bailey splash. Bailey would then eliminate the Powerhouse with a 619 before missing a second 619 attempt on Marshall, who hit a stunner to eliminate the Bulldog. Midnight would then attempt a chokeslam on Marshall, but the Prince would once again reverse the attempted move into a guillotine. When Midnight awoke, it was to the former Kid deriding him for getting eliminated. An enraged Midnight chokeslammed his former rival, handing the match to the blue team with both Marshall Sampson and Mad Mick surviving. 6 months later at the next event, Homecoming Mayhem, the new PWP Cairns Championship would be revealed with a one-night 8-man tournament to crown the first champion. In the first round, Mad Mick would once again even the score between himself and Dan the End, winning the match with an avalanche flatliner. Steve Andrews would face the former Charisma Kid, now going by the name Jack Razor, who exploited the Powerhouse's previously injured leg to pick up the win. Midnight would then finally receive his guaranteed title match from winning the first annual Rocco Rumble Battle Royal. But before the match could begin, Chaos would be attacked from behind by Marshall Sampson, out of revenge for costing him his spot in the Cairns Championship match earlier in the night. Chaos agreed to make the match a triple threat match, which Chaos would win after hitting Midnight in the head with the ring bell, breaking a chair on the Prince's back, and laying Midnight out with his sister Abigail for the win. In the main event 4-way elimination match for the Cairns Championship, Mad Mick would forfeit his place in the match to Dan after he suffered a rib injury in the qualifying match. Dan would go on to be eliminated by Bulldog Bailey in the match that was ultimately won by Jack Razor. The following month at Jeopardy, it was time for the second annual Rocco Rondelet Battle Royal. After Steve would eliminate Mick, who was still feeling the effects of his injury from the previous month, Dan would almost immediately eliminate Steve. The supposed final two came down to Midnight and Dan the End. A low blow helped Dan eliminate the previous year's winner, but Charlie D, who had been hiding outside the ring for most of the match, came back in to eliminate Dan and win, receiving a guaranteed title match in the future, which he would later in the night declare would be for the Tag Team Championship. Later in the night, Dan the End would face Steve Andrews in a last man standing match, which Dan won by taping Steve's legs together on the ring post. Midnight had been scheduled to face Jack Razor for the Cairns Championship, however Razor was unable to compete due to illness. Midnight would instead fill in for Superman Matt Midnight, who had taken time off after the birth of his child, in Bulldog Bailey's defense of the Tag Team Championship against Charlie D and Shinji. Due to a questionable call by the referee Sheriff K, Midnight would be the victim of a low blow and an eat defeat spear combo, losing the title to Charlie and Shinji's excellent tag team. The following month at Law and Disorder 2, Midnight would face Mad Mick in a singles match for the second time. This time, Midnight would be victorious after powering out of an attempted flatliner to hit Mick with a chokeslam. Dan the End would then face Lucky Logan Pierce in Logan's first match in PWP. Dan would cut off the young Brisbane wrestler with a spear to win the match. The following match would see Steve Andrews challenge Jack Razor for the Cairns Championship, which would end when Razor would roll the Powerhouse up, using the ropes for leverage. The final match of the night was the 5-on-5 Red vs Blue Tag Team Elimination match, pitting the blue team of the Mad End, Midnight, Superman Matt Midnight, and captained by Marshall Sampson, against the team of Steve Andrews, Logan Pierce, the PWP Cairns champion Jack Razor, and the PWP Tag Team champions Shinji and team captain Charlie D. The blue team would suffer many quick eliminations, with Matt Midnight and both members of the Mad End being eliminated before a single elimination occurred on the red team. While Marshall would eliminate Jack Razor, Midnight would eliminate both Logan Pierce and Steve Andrews before suffering yet another low blow to be eliminated by Charlie D before Marshall Sampson would be eliminated by another Eat Defeat Spear combo. The next month at Fallout, Marshall Sampson would announce that Chaos had been stripped of the PWP Championship and claim that as #1 contender, he should be awarded the title. Dan the End confronted Marshall, reminding Marshall that he had never beaten Dan, and claiming that he was next in line for a title shot. They would then be interrupted by former referee Sheriff K, wanting revenge on Marshall for his actions the previous month. Dan the End and Sheriff K agreed to a match to determine who would face Marshall Sampson in a 2 out of 3 falls match for the PWP Championship in the main event. Before that, however, Mad Mick would face off against Bulldog Bailey, ultimately catching a springboard attempt to hit Bailey with a crossroads for the win. In the following match against Dan the End and Sheriff K, Marshall Sampson would be present at ringside taking notes. Dan would win the match, pushing out of an equalizer attempt and hitting him with the spear. When Marshall would attempt a cheap shot on Dan, Dan would duck the pump kick and spear Marshall as well. Following this, Midnight would finally get his Cairns Championship match, which had been scheduled for 2 months prior. During the match, Midnight reminded Razor of what happened the last time they fought for a title, before chants of "We want tables" would begin. Despite everything thrown at him, Razor was unable to take Midnight down, ultimately resorting to intentionally getting himself disqualified with a blatant low blow, losing the match but retaining his championship. After Razor left the ring, Midnight would get on the mic and tell Razor,
"This started with a table! It's gonna end with a table!"
Midnight and Mad Mick would both take part in the first ever Briefcase of Gold match. While Mick would be eliminated by Sheriff K, Midnight would be eliminated by a roll-up from Jack Razor, with an assist from Bulldog Bailey and a handful of tights. In the main event, Dan the End would face Marshall Sampson in a best 2 out of 3 falls match for the PWP Championship. Dan would win the first fall after hitting Marshall with the TKO. During the second fall, Sheriff K would make his way to the ring, leaving his nightstick Lady Justice in the ring. Dan would hit Marshall with Lady Justice, handing the Prince the second fall by disqualification. Dan seemed to have the third fall in hand, but in a shocking moment, Sheriff K would hand Lady Justice to Marshall and attack Dan, allying himself with the Prince of Port Douglas and helping Marshall Sampson become the new PWP champion. The following month would see a joint show between Pro Wrestling Power and Townsville's Queensland Wrestling Alliance, for whom Marshall Sampson, Sheriff K and Jack Razor have all worked. The opening match saw Midnight defeat Jack Razor, though without any tables, to win the PWP Cairns Championship after Razor was stopped by the referee from hitting Midnight with the belt. In the following match though, Dan the End would face off against Sheriff K. As Dan set up for the spear, Jack Razor would come through the curtain, distracting Dan and allowing Sheriff K to hit the equalizer for the win. Marshall would reveal that he had paid Razor to assist Sheriff K in the match, but after a brief intermission to fix an issue with the ring ropes, tensions would rise between Razor and the Prince. Marshall, who was acting as host for the night, would make an impromptu tag match pitting the team of Jack Razor and Sheriff K against the team of Dan the End and Midnight. Despite years of feuding, Midnight and Dan the End seemed perfectly capable of working together, ultimately picking up the win. But after the match...
Woo! Make some noise!
Oh my God, watch out! Watch out! Watch him!
Give it to you, mate. Hey,
Oh, there you go.
paranoid.
So sweet. Woo!
I'm next in line.
In the years since that event, 3 of these 4 men have remained quiet on the wrestling front. However, in May, Midnight briefly moved to Sydney to continue his journey. Under the tutelage of the deadly shot Kasai, Midnight wrestled names such as the Birdman Phil Picasso, Aries, and even his new mentor. After 4 months, Midnight returned to Cairns and is looking to defend his Cairns championship. Who will step up? And what new alliances will the Red vs. Blue main event forge? It all takes place on November 25th at Law and Disorder 3. Tickets are available at the link in the description, or for those who aren't in Cairns, keep your eyes on this channel for the full show and the days after.